Welcome to the session on identifying your funding needs. I'd like to do this session at the very beginning because it helps me set some expectations for you all that I hope that you'll hold on to throughout the course. So discretionary grants are awesome in terms of providing funding for new initiatives. There's lots of funding in very specific areas like behavioral health and its intersection with courts, human trafficking and the intersection of courts, those types of things. It's not the place to go to support your basic operating expenses. As I mentioned in our first call, we absolutely believe that courts will be struggling with their budgets for the next year or two. Unfortunately, federal grants are definitely not going to be the place to go to make up for some of those budget cuts generally. And it's definitely not the place to go to create funding that has no strings attached to it. There's always lots and lots of strings attached to federal funding. So I want to just set a realistic expectation from the beginning about that and talk a little bit about where should you start. And so there's two ways to approach the upcoming grant season. The first is to wait until the grants start coming out and then think of them as your shopping list of sorts and say yes and no as they come out. And that's a very reactive approach to grant making. It's not really what I encourage you to do. I really encourage you to use this time before the grants start coming out to really focus internal within your community on identifying and prioritizing your needs, both at the court level and as a justice system, and then find the funding that matches those needs that you've already prioritized. In the long run, that is a more sustainable, more focused way of using grant funding as a portion of how you build your justice system. So what should you be doing right now? So if your court has a strategic plan, I would definitely start there and look at what your priorities were as you went through the planning process and think about how you might use grant funding, federal grant funding, to support any of those needs that have already been prioritized by your leadership. A second place to go are any kind of strategic plans that you might have established as a justice system. So I know not everybody has criminal justice coordinating councils or some variation of that, but to the extent that you do, that can be a wonderful place to help think about what you might approach federal funding to support. If you don't have plans in place, if that's not something that your court or your community has been able to achieve, it may be time to schedule an internal brainstorming session with your leadership and really just spend time doing a complete brain dump of all of the things that you could prioritize, that you could possibly fund, without any sort of rank ordering initially, just getting all the ideas out on paper. But you do eventually want to get to the place where you have kind of a top 5 priorities so that, again, as the grants start coming out, you can look at the grants and compare them to things that have been prioritized by somebody so that you know whether it's a good opportunity to continue to read about or whether it's something that you should pass on. So I really do encourage you to not be reactive to every solicitation that comes out. That can be very draining on the grant writing staff, and it can really put you in a place where you're pursuing things that don't align with priorities for your system, and those are very hard to sustain. So that can create a really challenging cycle and may ultimately lead to your community being a little less supportive of grants in general. Because if you're not pursuing things that are perceived as priorities, just because at the moment they look exciting, then there may not be the long-term support for those ideas. Partnerships really are the corner of grant success. I will say that the communities that I've seen be the most successful are strong in their partnerships. Their partnerships exist well before the solicitations come out. You can really tell when you are reading a grant application in which the partnerships are put together solely and strictly for the application versus those that have been a year or two in the making and are deep in their support for one another. It is going to be the situation that the courts are not going to be the applicant for some grant applications. It's just reality that your partners have access to a larger number of funding streams and in many instances have a stronger infrastructure to manage the grants. So that's not bad if the court has the partnerships to be able to benefit from those partnerships to attain the resources that are needed to support the court in broader justice initiatives. And I know it can be kind of a source of tension that a lot of federal grant streams are not directed specifically to the courts, but I encourage you to think about it more broadly and to be very clear in your mind before the grant season starts about the types of resources that your partners have that you could benefit from so that you can communicate that very clearly. So that looks something like, I'm just going to throw out an example, that you as a justice system would like to pursue a grant to expedite processing of a particular case type. And it may be that the court is not the applicant, but you may identify that the need of the court to support that project is a data analyst. And so the court may not be the applicant, you may get the grant, but what the court would like out of it is this data analytic support and funding to do that. And so you'll want to be able to communicate very clearly to the applicant that that would be something that you would really like to see as a subaward to the court. So again, the court would not be the applicant, but you're getting the things that you need to be part of broader initiatives funded through your partnerships grants. So I encourage you to think about that. So ideally, if you follow my process, you will have some meetings. You will come up with a really, really long list of things that you would ideally like to fund that might look a little bit initially like a shopping list. But the goal is to ultimately kind of move away from that idea and really come to a consensus process, through a consensus process, come to a place where you have kind of a top 5 immediate priorities that are things that grants fund. So it's not any good if the top 5 things are things that are really not realistic to be funded by a federal grant. And then there can be this secondary list of additional needs that if the perfect grant comes along, that's a great fit for 2 or 3 other things on your additional needs list. Fabulous. You may want to go to that list. But so the grant writer and the grant team has a clear vision of what you're looking for funding for. So that's all I wanted to say on identifying your funding needs. Lots of people skip over this step. And I think the problem in skipping over this step is, again, that you become reactive. You may respond to solicitations that are not well supported by your leadership, by your system, your justice system, and then they become unsustainable. That's not a loop you want to get into. So I hope that you will spend some time going through these steps, and we can chat more about that offline if you have any questions.